This video contains a lot of snarky remarks. If you don't like it, kick rocks and drink Damien's Moon Water. Hi, I'm Rick, and this is Burn After Reading. In this episode, I'm covering Bob Ruff's shitty and poorly made Forgotten WM3 two-episode series. I won't be covering his Truth and Justice podcast on the subject because that would take too much time, and there are other things I would rather be doing, such as watch paint dry, get a Brazilian wax, get an unnecessary colonoscopy, go to the wrong airport and miss my flight by less than 5 minutes and have to sit in the airport for 6 hours until the next available flight. Get stuck in standstill traffic for over an hour within 5 minutes of my destination. Anyway, I think you get the picture, and with that said, let's get into it. The two-part series started out with Pam Hicks reflecting on her son Stevie Branch and how much she misses him. The next scene has Bob Ruff sitting across the table from her and asked who she thinks killed her son. Pam responded that she doesn't know. She then begins to cry as Bob Ruff, like some hero at the beginning of a movie, promises Pam he's going to put everything he has into finding out who committed this crime, while cinematic thriller music played in the background. Then the title of the show appeared, The Forgotten West Memphis 3. Bob goes into how he started helping the potential wrongfully convicted and investigating cold cases. He talked about how he was a fire chief and a fire investigator for around 15 years. In his delusional mind, he figured his skill set as a fire investigator somehow made him qualified to investigate criminal cases. To me, that's like saying because someone was a food health inspector for 10 years made him qualified to inspect fire damage and crimes. But I digress. He goes into how he started true crime podcasting. He rambled on about Ed Ates and took part of the credit along with his supporters and the Innocence Project in helping Ates get parole. You see, it never impresses me when someone maintains their innocence. Charles Manson maintained his innocence. Is that supposed to dazzle me? Still, as of this series, Ed Ates was not exonerated. Nothing has been overturned. He just got parole. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying Ed is innocent or guilty. I didn't look into his case, but I am stating the facts as I know them based in law. Okay, let's get back on track. Bob then summarized and highlighted the case of the West Memphis 3 to the audience, and Bob, of course, gave a slanted view, acting as if the West Memphis Police Department only focused on Damien, which isn't true. He minimized Damien's mental health issues and conveniently left out some of the truly disturbing things about his, mental health, and you can read the Exhibit 500 at the Callahan site, and you can see for yourself. Bob used the same old tired belief that it was a witch hunt. Never mind that Damien was telling people like Jerry Driver that he was in a cult, so gee golly, wonder how anyone ever got that impression. Again, Bob was framing the narrative in his very independent and clearly unbiased investigation. Bob goes into Jason Baldwin, which he is right that Jason never gave any incriminating statements. If you exclude his confession to Michael Carson, but Damien did in fact tell other people, such as some girls he spoke to before and after the murders, that Jason was in fact with him. And then you got Jesse Miss Kelly's multiple confessions before and after his conviction, which of course leads us to Jesse. Bob goes into his low IQ and how Jesse thought he was going in there for a follow-up based on a statement made weeks earlier. Of course, Bob leaves out that the police didn't see Jesse as a suspect initially, as they were questioning many people and giving polygraph tests. But the thing that alerted law enforcement was that Jesse failed his polygraph. One of the officers said he was lying his ass off. Now, you all know how I feel about polygraph tests, but it can be an effective investigative tool, and I believe in this case that's exactly what happened. Bob's assessment is totally wrong in my opinion. Bob acted as if Jesse didn't know his rights. Jesse had run-ins with law enforcement due to violent behavior and other things. This idea that he was an easy target is just absolutely absurd. It wasn't absurd to Lee Rush, Jesse's father's girlfriend at the time, When Jesse would wake her up crying after the murders, or when Jesse acted strange to Buddy Lucas and gave his shoes that potentially were worn by him at the crime scene. Now, Lucas got persuaded not to testify during Jesse's trial, but the connections are alarming. Jesse wasn't an easy target. Jesse knew he was caught and did his best to minimize involvement and gave some false information to trip law enforcement up. Jesse explained this to two other officers. He again confessed to his lawyer, who made him swear on a Bible, and yet Bob and supporters closed their eyes and ears to this like they're in Netflix's Bird Box. Now, Bob goes on to state that despite a lack of physical evidence linking them to the murders, which is due to everything being cleaned up and submerged in muddy water for nearly 18 to 24 hours before discovery, the West Memphis Three were convicted and scapegoats. I'm not sure if Bob ever commented on the Scott Peterson trial, but should we expect an action series on that one? No real DNA links Scott to Lacey's murder. He was tried and convicted based on circumstantial evidence, based on the totality of the evidence. Is Scott a scapegoat for Bob? I don't know. I'll let him answer that. Now, Bob then goes on about the Paradise Lost series and the celebrity support and the rally cry to free the West Memphis Three. He talked about how some of the family members, namely Pam Hicks and John Mark Byers, believed that they were innocent. Next, Bob goes on about how the West Memphis Three were freed in what I consider to be a deceptive way. He said that the prosecutor had to do something, so after 18 years in prison, the West Memphis Three were offered the Alford plea. No. Let's back up. First of all, it was the West Memphis Three defense who proposed the plea to the prosecutor. It was not the other way around. Now, yes, the prosecutor agreed to it, and the defense confirmed with the West Memphis Three that they would accept all terms despite any reservations from Jason, which I personally feel was posturing to appear like some kind of champion of justice. I didn't buy his bullshit then, and I don't buy it now. It reminds me of something from the John Mark Byers playbook. So Bob goes on to say that if the West Memphis Three didn't kill Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch, then who did? He preached heroic as he overlooked past the water and pipe bridge with 1,000-yard stare and proclaimed that he will do the proper investigation, and while he can't bring back the children, he will give them and the families justice. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Bob Ruff, crime-fighting truth seeker with no fucking credentials as a criminal investigator. He's going to solve the case. The cheese levels are off the charts. So what do we get into in part one? Well, we get a lot of filler. He goes back to the beginning where it all took place. He goes to the crime scene that has long changed. This means Bob can't really get the same feel that the actual qualified law enforcement investigators had at that time. You know, the ones he thinks he's better than. But that's okay because he's going to do a real and proper investigation. At this point, I'm surprised he's not wearing red and blue spandex with a cape or wearing a Sherlock Holmes outfit. In my opinion, that would really embody his attitude because this dude has a massive ego complex. Instead, we just have to deal with him in his jeans and midlife crisis leather jacket. Now, let's see what Bob uncovers. So Bob Ruff interviews Ryan Clark, the older brother of Christopher Byers. He's shrouded in shadow because he'd rather strangers don't look at him as the man with the murdered brother, which, makes sense. He talked about Christopher as a good kid and talked about his interests. Ryan discussed what was going on in his head the night of the murders, and eventually when, the three boys were discovered. Ryan seems pretty receptive to Bob's investigation, going as far as to say if he can figure it out, he'd be in his debt and he would be like a brother. The camera shifts to Bob, who looks like a deer in headlights. Just my opinion. That's what it looked like. It was just expressionless. So Bob explained to the viewers that he hates making family members relive these horrific events by rehashing them, but it must be done to get to the truth. Bob talked to JoLynn Hicks, Stevie Branch's aunt. JoLynn goes into Stevie's character a bit. Bob asked JoLynn how it affected Pam, which, seems like a stupid question. How the fuck do you think it's going to affect a mother whose child was brutally murdered? But, again, who am I to question our beloved superhero, Bob? JoLynn stated the obvious that it put a huge hole in Pam's heart, a void that can never be filled. JoLynn goes into law enforcement and how she initially felt they were there for them, and how she tried to respect them, but her opinion shifted. She felt the investigation wasn't done properly. We now go into Pam Hicks, who walked Bob through the day Stevie went missing and eventually discovered. Bob then asked the question we know the answers to because he's a super good investigator. I mean, I wonder if Bob ever randomly asked people, when you're hungry, what do you do? I imagine the look of shock on his face when they answer, eat. Bob then meets Dr. Rebecca Shue, pathologist, to go over the wounds on the children's bodies. He claimed it's to find out what really happened, but it's the same song and dance. Someone is paid to give an interpretation that favors the narrative they want to give. Remember Spitz? Dogs did it. So in this case, it's going back to alligator, turtles, or other aquatic life inflicting the wounds. Again, these can only be interpreted and aren't a matter of fact. Why didn't Bob, let's say, talk to 5 pathologists? If he did, what did they say and is it on record? Maybe Oxygen gave him a certain budget, or maybe they told him who to go to. I mean, who knows? Having said that, there's also interpretation to lead that the wounds were made by a bladed weapon and other blunt objects like sticks or clubs. They match better and make more sense, but shh, can't ruin the narrative. Wrongfully convicted true crime stories create cash. Can't mess with that. Another thing I'd like to add to this is that they limit the conversation of the wounds due to animal inflicted versus satanic ritual, which is quite odd to me. Why isn't the possibility of it being just straight up torture not brought up? We have 3 different people doing 3 different things to these poor little boys. So yeah, I would say that would make the wounds pretty fucking irregular. But if you limit the narratives, it helps lean towards one side against the other. Instead of a thorough investigation, it seems like Super Bob is acting like a defense attorney to create doubt. The only assessment I agree with when it comes to Rebecca Shue is that these kids ultimately died from drowning. Bob then goes on to say that this takes a new turn into the investigation, but he's just piggybacking off the Paradise Lost claims with the exception of Brent Turvey's profile, which I believe he said that the kids were killed elsewhere and then placed in the water ditch sometime after. But everything with the post-mortem wounds coming from animals is the same. Again, a narrative and an interpretation to discredit the wounds inflicted by the killers, as Bob claimed that the real monster is still there and the poor West Memphis 3 have to live their lives as convicted murderers. I mean, pretty objective investigation, right? Bob goes back to 1993 and talked about 2 probation officers who were obsessed with satanic cults. They believed a cult existed in West Memphis and that Damien had involvement. When the children's bodies were discovered, one of the probation officers said that Damien finally did it. He finally killed someone. Now, Bob acted like these probation officers just pulled this shit out of their ass. What Bob doesn't tell you, as I mentioned earlier, Bob planted those ideas in their head. He talked about being involved in a cult. He told them that the cult was going to advance from animal sacrifice to human sacrifice. But this idea that the West Memphis Police Department had tunnel vision, I believe, is absolutely false. They were looking at many people. Bob then talked to former FBI profiler Jim Clemente, or as I like to call him, John Douglas 2.0. You could see him at a CrimeCon event near you. So Bob walked Jim through the events via an interactive map. From what I gathered, Jim doesn't know anything of this crime, which I find a little hard to believe, but for the sake of argument, let's just go with it. The satanic ritual thing keeps getting brought up, but let's be realistic here. Motive isn't the issue. A motive is not mandatory to prove. It's just the totality of evidence that the accused in fact did it. Think again, Manson family trials and the prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi's helter-skelter theory. Whether it was really Manson's view of the impending race war or Manson scorned over the fact that he wasn't getting a record deal, the fact is he convinced his members to murder people. Criminal profiler Pat Brown believed that the West Memphis 3 are guilty of the crimes, but thinks less of the satanic ritual aspect and thinks more of the thrill kill motive. It can even be a mixture of Damien, as, he believed that, drinking blood or tasting blood gave him power, made him feel like a god. That's all well documented. So maybe that did play a part in it, but I think overall it was probably more of a thrill kill. So Dr. Shu and Clemente believed this wasn't ritualistic, which is fine. But there's misdirection here. It doesn't have to be for the West Memphis Three to be guilty, be it ritualistic or a thrill kill. And the limitations can lead to false narratives. So Bob is the pot calling the kettle black. In fact, what Jesse stated in all his confessions is something that was perverse, sadistic, and brutal. That would demonstrate a teenage thrill kill by three intoxicated teens. Remember, Jesse said that they were all drinking. That would explain the three different ways the knots were tied. It would explain the imperfections of how the kids were tied, but they were cautious enough to want to hide and clean up what they did. I mean, at least Jason and Damien. If we were to believe that Jesse left earlier, then okay, there's that, but maybe he did help. But bottom line is, he was there for at least most of what happened. Bob also does a stupid experiment where he puts chicken carcasses in the water. The snapping turtles pick the chickens clean straight to the bone. So, if the turtles caused those injuries on the children based on his stupid and very unscientific experiment, the same should have been virtually identical to three children. Their flesh should have been picked clean. But that's not what happened. Maybe the next experiment Bob can do is dangle his bare legs in the water and see what happens. Now, I think Bob is going to spin that this experiment was just to see if snapping turtles or whatever other aquatic life showed up, then that could be relevant. But if you really took that shit into a trial, your ass would be laughed out of the courtroom. Anyway, Bob now goes to the Arkansas State University to meet Dr. Lori Newman Lee, who is a herpetologist. Dr. Lori goes over what we already know. Different snapping turtles have claws and can bite. Bob showed Dr. Lori photos of the boy's wounds. She tells Bob what he wants to hear with terms like consistent with or could be, except for the last image. It begs for interpretation, but reveals no actual definitive conclusion or facts. Bob talked about looking at the facts and the evidence without speculation, which makes me think he doesn't know what facts and evidence means, because that's all he's doing during this entire fucking episode. He cherry picks people to get the answers he wants to and moves in that direction that is contradictory to the real facts and evidence. Anyone who has read the case files or watched the series or listened to Lisa O'Brien, Roberta Glass, or William Ramsey and others, they know Bob's super investigation falls flat. It's smoke and mirrors. It's entertainment for Oxygen and his podcast. I mean, I seriously hope his fire investigations went better than this, or else I really feel sorry for the department that he served under. But nevertheless, Super Bob is extremely frustrated, sad, and angry that the case was never solved. But don't worry, it motivates him, and I am sure monetization has no motive whatsoever. So Super Bob will serve justice and make the evildoers pay. Super Bob, or the Dark Ruff, whatever you want to call him, is the hero West Memphis deserves. Next, we move on to part 2. Jim Clemente suggested to Bob that they use some new technology to collect from the existing evidence. So Bob goes to Pure Gold Forensics to meet Susanna Ryan, who specializes in MVAC. Now, Bob kept using the word new technology, but it's important to clarify that MVAC was around if the West Memphis 3 legal team wanted to use it to test or retest DNA while in prison or 3 years after they accepted the Alford plea per the statute. Instead, petitions are being filed 8 years after the statute and in the wrong county, multiple times to boot. Now that we have that understanding, let's move on. Susanna explained the technology to Bob. In narration, Bob explained the limited testing available in 1993, which is true, but still failed to admit the technology was available during later appeals and the post-Alford plea in the 3-year time frame that they had to get new testing done. Bob asked Susanna if older cases, let's say 25 years, would they still be able to pull viable DNA? And Susanna answered that they've gotten great results from cases that were up to 40 years old, which is very impressive. However, she also stated it depended on the evidence at the crime scene. Was it outdoors for weeks or months on end? Was it exposed to extreme heat or water or something like that? She clearly stated those factors can hinder results. Still, Bob needed the right answer or it's the end of the line for the MVAC testing, so he asked, well, what if it was a shoe binding with knots? What then? She said it can, which sounds more like a maybe to me. There's no conclusive answer to whether it actually can. She even admitted again that when it comes to other items like clothes and sticks, that it's less likely to get results. Still, Bob puts all his chips that MVAC is the answer. So Bob, not understanding laws and statutes and jurisdictions, thought that he could just ask Scott Ellington for the evidence and hand it over to Susanna for testing. Bob used some mental gymnastics to put it on Scott Ellington that if new credible evidence was presented that Scott would consider looking at it. Problem is, this isn't new credible evidence. So Bob wanted to open up a dialogue with Scott Ellington to get this done. So for the purpose of good TV, Bob called Scott Ellington's office on his cell and asked for him. And of course, Scott wasn't available. So while he waited to hear back from Ellington, Bob would reach out to Damien, Jason, and Jesse to see if it would be cool and hoped that the district attorney in good faith would just allow Bob to have the evidence retested. So Bob asked Jason first. Jason rambled about even though he's free, he feels lost. You know, dramatic stuff for the show. Bob the hero told Jason that they're going to keep fighting and that there's this new technology for new testing. And Jason, in an awkward way, said that he was for it. Bob then wanted to cover victimology. This part of the show is filler, but Bob, the hero, wanted to pretend that he's doing a thorough investigation by asking them questions that weren't asked in 1993. I mean, never mind, it's only been 25 years at that time of this shit show of a series, and memories do fade and become selective in time. But you know, I think Bob thinks he's better than law enforcement, so he's going to do it anyway. So Bob talked to Jamie Ballard, who in 2009 wrote an affidavit that she saw Christopher, Stevie, and Michael playing in her backyard the night of the murders from about 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Bob also discussed the possibility of a fourth boy who may have been with the other three. So Bob boasts that if he can find this fourth boy, he'd be the first to do that, believing he would have had first-hand account of what the boys were doing and who they came in contact with. So Bob reached out to his Bobo-maniacs, aka his listeners, and asked if they thought there was a fourth boy. One of his followers sent him screenshots of someone named George Taylor, who claimed several years on a Facebook page that he was traveling with Stevie, Michael, and Christopher that day. So Bob called Pam Hicks and asked about George, and she confirmed that she knew him and he was friends with Stevie. So Bob reached out to George and they met. Long story short, it was dead end with lies and fake out revelations. And it's just an utter waste of time and maybe a reason why maybe police didn't follow up on it. But don't worry, everyone. Bob looked into it just to make sure. Again, it was just filler. Bob also talked to Bobby Posey, who told police that Chris came to his house alone that afternoon. Posey in his, he's in jail, and Bob had to set up a call with him. Posey told Bob that Christopher Byers came to his house that day and told him that John Mark was hurting him again and was going to run away. Posey suggested Bob talk to Carlos Seals. Bob, with his midlife crisis leather jacket, met with Carlos, and he suggested that he may have been the last one to see the boys that day. He claimed, the kids had sleeping bags and backpacks and were going camping. So now the narrative is that the kids weren't just going into the woods, but running away into the woods. Due to Jamie mentioning Ryan Clark in her affidavit, we shift to Bob talking to Ryan again. In that discussion, Ryan gets into how John Mark Byers was as a person and as a stepdad. Ryan never liked him from the beginning, and that he said that John Mark Byers had nothing to do with Christopher, and it drove him nuts to see him on TV, crying about how much he loved and missed him. But in reality, according to Ryan, he hated Christopher. Ryan goes on to dismiss Jamie Ballard's affidavit, giving Inspector Bob the belief that Carlos Seals' testimony to be the correct one. Never mind that perhaps both testimonies are bogus, but Carlos' testimony helped set up the narrative, which leads us back to Jim Clemente to go over the timeline. Now, as Bob goes over the timeline and other parts of his investigation, Jim just takes whatever Bob is saying as fact without actually looking over the case files to check the credibility of it. But lastly, Bob goes into narration again, clownishly comparing fire investigation with murder investigation and how you gotta shift through the ashes to find the truth and who the killer really is. So, this concludes episode 1 of Bob's Shitty Forgotten West Memphis 3 series. There's another episode, episode 2. Episode 2 starts with theories. Bob tells us that he truly believes this case is solvable, and it comes with a lot of pressure because he's given hope to some of the West Memphis 3 and the victims' families. He just wants justice for Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. He believes the killer is still out there and could kill again, or maybe has already done so. He goes on about how prosecuting attorney Scott Ellington made a promise that if any new evidence comes to light, that he would consider looking into it. He then confuses new evidence with new technology, and of course that's referring to MVAC. He sets the tone that Ellington has something to hide, claiming that the DAs in the past have always been cooperative in his other investigations. Remember, being a fire investigator, as he once was, is just like being a criminal investigator. So Bob thinks that if he can get all 3 convicted on board for new testing, it will convince Ellington to hand over everything so that he could take it to the MVAC people to test the evidence. In episode 1, he already got Jason's awkward approval, so now it's time to get consent from the other 2. Bob gives us a Damien Eccles history lesson. He says Damien didn't know the victims and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene whatsoever. First of all, he didn't have to know the 3 boys to have done something cruel to them. Damien had a violent and threatening history, as I've mentioned in previous episodes. There's also evidence he stalked these kids, and he did in fact, despite what Damien claimed later, knew the crime scene. He lived at the Mayfair Apartments at one point and even wrote about it in one of his books. As for evidence, you're dealing with a crime scene that's outside and water washed away definitive evidence with areas also slicked off. There was evidence, but that evidence ultimately wasn't conclusive. This was a circumstantial case. Bob goes on to say Damien was the focus of the police investigation because he identified as a non-Christian, didn't like authority, and was already disliked by law enforcement. Okay, what Bob doesn't tell you is that maybe there was a reason for that dislike. Damien threatened police officers and his ex-girlfriend's father in a confrontation. Did that one slip Bob's mind? I mean, are we just going to gloss over it and minimize it because, we know Damien and anything he explains, he never does that, right? Clearly, everything that comes out of that little turd's mouth is gospel. Anyway, Bob goes on to say that as soon as the children's bodies were discovered, Damien became law enforcement's one and only suspect. Again, what Bob doesn't tell you is that law enforcement checked truckers' logs at the Blue Beacon, looked into registered sex offenders. Anyone remember when early in the investigation, the West Memphis Police Department briefly regarded 2 West Memphis teenagers as suspects, that being Chris Morgan and Brian Holland? They abruptly departed for Oceanside, California, 4 days after the bodies were discovered. Does that sound like Damien was the one and only suspect or even person of interest? Did the West Memphis Police Department not follow up and contacted law enforcement in California so they can question those kids? In fact, it was a pretty intense interrogation. Anyway, Bob contacts Damien and asks him questions like what life was like, after prison. And honestly, I don't feel like going into that. It's all filler. I don't care. Bob tells Damien about MVAC, and Damien is all for it. So Bob now has his consent, and let's move on. So Bob's next mission is to find Waldo, aka Jesse Miskelly, so that he can get his consent to test the evidence with MVAC. According to Bob, Jesse doesn't have a phone, email, or a permanent address, so Jesse has worked pretty hard to stay away from the media and the spotlight. But don't you worry, Bob will avoid someone's personal space just so he can get their consent. Before Bob can find him, he goes into why the West Memphis 3 case made no sense. He claimed all the boys had alibis, which isn't true. Jesse's alibis never held up, and they were debunked, as was Damien's. Jason's alibis were so bad that his defense attorney refused to even try to make one up for him. Bob talks about lack of evidence connecting the three to the crime scene, which I already went over. I don't want to be redundant. Bob also forgets that circumstantial evidence is often used to convict people. Let's get into that a little bit. There are times police do not have any physical evidence connecting the defendant or defendants to the crime, so they rely on evidence such as witness testimony and circumstantial clues to argue that the defendant or defendants is guilty. In order to find an accused person guilty in a circumstantial evidence case, the judge or jury must be satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that the only rational inference that can be drawn from circumstantial evidence is that the accused is guilty. Circumstantial evidence is not to be evaluated piece by piece during the criminal trial, but rather on the totality. 24 jurors in the two different trials felt the state met the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. But that's not good enough for Bob. He's smarter. He's smarter than those other 24 people that heard the evidence. They're dumb. They were misled. They don't know what they're doing. Anyways, I digress. Bob then states that Jesse's confession was the only thing connecting the West Memphis 3 to the crime scene, which isn't true. I mean, technically Jesse's confession was the initial spark to tie it all together. But then after that, we start getting other things, such as Michael Carson's testimony regarding Jason confessing to him, Damien bragging about it at a park, the Hollingsworth clan spotting Damien near the crime scene, either with Jason or Dominique, depending on how you want to interpret that. And that's just to name a few. Like I already said, Jason's confession was the initial spark in putting it all together, but saying it was the only thing, in my opinion, is both ignorant and disingenuous. This, of course, leads Bob to get into Jesse's confession. Bob basically goes over the same crap already discussed in the Paradise Lost series. So Bob gets one of his experts, Jim Trainum, retired DC homicide detective, to tell him exactly what he wants to hear and that it was a forced confession. Because, murderers, they never initially deny that they were, that they murdered someone. They offer that shit up right away, right? I mean, once they do, never do they lie about the details to minimize their actions. Surely they never recant later on. I mean, we're talking about honest killers here. They would never lie. I mean, they'll kill, but they won't lie. No way. Anyone remember Chris Watts giving different confessions about how and why he murdered his wife, Shannon Watts, and his daughters? Chris claimed that he killed Shannon after she killed their daughters. Later, however, he confessed to killing, his wife and daughters, and now Chris is saying that he was framed for the murders and he wasn't even home when it happened. Anyway, Jim Trainum gives his opinion, but keep in mind that's what it is. He's taking one piece of many confessions and making an opinion on incomplete information. Not everyone agrees with Trainum about false confessions. Even Lou Hennessy, a district court judge in Charles County, Maryland, disagrees. To this day, Hennessy has doubts about Trainum's account of how cops get false confessions. And hey, Hennessy isn't an enemy of Trainum. Hennessy believes Trainum is a good investigator and friend. Bob then goes into the Mr.Bojangles theory. In short, on the night of the murders, an African-American man walked into the Mr.Bojangles restaurant. A mother and daughter told the manager, Marty King, that someone was in the women's bathroom and wouldn't leave. The manager went into the bathroom and found the African-American man disarrayed, dirty with mud on his feet, and was bloody. He also had a blue Velcro cast on his arm. Marty called the police, but the man left before the police showed up. So from the crime scene, the bayou leads directly to the Mr.Bojangles restaurant. So the theory is that Mr. Bojangles used the bayou to distance himself and conceal himself from anyone spotting him. Of course, this thought is absurd. I mean, let's think this out loud, shall we? So this guy commits the crime against 3 boys, basically one-handed. He hog-ties them, cleans the evidence, puts the boys in the water ditch, puts their clothes and uses sticks so that it doesn't escape. He conceals himself until he gets to the restaurant and then all of a sudden decides to show himself bloody and muddy. I mean, the logic doesn't make any sense. So Bob conducts another one of his dumbass experiments by getting Jeff, last name not known, who is a former Special Forces operator, to make the trek from the crime scene to the Mr. Bojangles restaurant, or what used to be known as the Mr. Bojangles restaurant. Jeff has 45 minutes or less to get there. Turned out it only took a highly trained Special Forces operator around 17 minutes, which I guess proves that a Special Forces operator could make it from the crime scene to the restaurant. Okay. The Special Forces officer, he offers what I think are my same thoughts on how it doesn't make any sense to conceal yourself from the bayou just to go into a populated area. Bob agrees with that too. So this silly experiment was, again, another wasteful filler. Bob concludes what we already know, and that Mr. Bojangles is not a viable suspect. Thank God we had Bob to figure that out, or else we never would have got to that conclusion. As Bob continues to locate Jesse, he meets with Jim Clementi again so Jim can share his victimology profile with Bob. So what does Jim have for us? Well, we got 3 8-year-old boys. It's a small and relatively safe town. The boys are unsupervised. They're low-risk victims, and they're in a low-risk environment. The offender had to at some point approach the victims. Approach is important because there's 3 boys, and there's nothing forensically that more than one person was involved. Now, let me go ahead and break right there. The victims were tied with 3 distinct knots. This pointed to 3 killers involved in the murders. So just wanted to say that, so let's move on. What happened there was consistent throughout. The consistency shows a singular offender and not multiple. Again, I call bullshit on that. One offender was able to control 3 boys without any help. Couldn't have been a stranger who looked threatening because the reaction would be for the boys to run away. Hence, this was an offender that the boys knew. Behavioral indicators point to who was either a biological relative or a family member or a community member, someone they thought they could trust. If boys thought that they were doing something wrong, like staying out late, drinking, smoking, etc., it would be easier to control them because the kids would feel they deserve punishment. But the punishment goes too far. Gender role based on concealment is a masculine thing. Also, the level of violence. 1 or 2 boys incapacitated because the way the boys were tied would give them some chance to move and possibly get away. So the way they were tied was more of a practical way to conceal versus a restraining method. Offender would have to have some knowledge as a butcher or hunter because it wasn't a planned event. It was someone who got enraged, took it too far, and having to clean up the mess. Offender got rid of the bikes due to known relationship, spent more time concealing crime than the actual murders. Offender, biological or family member, over-disciplined one of the boys. It went too far, so he had to kill the other 2. Age was a factor. Younger people are more impulsive, but older people can collect themselves under extreme pressure. Person would have a long-term job or relationship, possibly in his 30s. Offender is prone to violent outbursts. History of domestic violence. I think most of you can see where this is going, right? Which family members have been accused of this before? Who is the latest to be accused? More on that part later, but I'd like to point out that criminal profiler Pat Brown also profiled this case and had a completely different opinion. In her research on the case, this is what she has to say about the crime. The crimes were committed by more than one person. The offenders lived nearby the crime scene. The boys were targeted because they were easy to access and control. The boys were probably followed and conned or lured into the woods. The boys were overpowered by larger assailants, and the crime was committed at the scene, most likely in the water during the waning daylight hours. The crime was planned, but not in the sense that it would necessarily end with homicide. Like waddling, crimes involving groups of young teens often end extremely violently. Nothing but a knife or two was brought with the offenders, nor was anything but weapons taken away. This shows lack of maturity or criminal experience. The offenders did not attempt to get rid of the evidence. The water was a lucky break. The crime was violent and was a show of power. Essentially, it was a thrill kill. I'll link both a blog entry and YouTube video where Pat goes into this in more depth, but I wanted to show that Jim's profile is disputed. Bob finally tracks down Jesse at someone's trailer. Someone answers the door and lets Bob in. As he enters, the person who let him in also tells Jesse that Bob the investigator is here to see him. Jesse is not interested. It's alleged that Jesse had a bad toothache. I don't know if that's true or not, but I guess it doesn't really matter. However, Bob doesn't let someone's personal wishes get in the way of getting what he wants. Bob, imposing his will, asks Jesse if he can get his consent to do new DNA testing on the evidence. Jesse says that's fine, and so Bob now has consent from all three of the convicted. Such a wonderful television moment. Bob is excited. So Bob tries to reach out to Scott Ellington so that he can have Scott just hand over the evidence to him to be tested. Scott nor any of his representatives responded back, and now Bob is mad. How dare a state prosecutor just not hand over evidence to be tested, because clearly in the past, never has the side of the defendant skewed details of results. No bias whatsoever. I mean, it's like Bob has never taken a position, right? Bob has no dog in the fight. Complete neutrality here. I mean, he's only falsely assumed that this case wasn't solved. He's using the flawed premise that it hasn't because it's now on the shoulders of him, Big Bad Bob. And in a hubris tone, he says he will not allow Scott Ellington to get in the way of finding the truth. I mean, we're dealing with the last outlaw here. Does he think he's Batman? You know, some vigilante detective who's going to solve the case because the system is corrupt and only he can save everybody. I don't know why, but for some reason, when he walks in slow-mo in some of these scenes, I'm just playing in the back of my head Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive, and I can't help but laugh. But anyways, the show now goes into persons of interest. Bob limits the criteria of how this case can be solved. It appears that he's throwing away circumstantial evidence, and the only method that must be used now is forensics and science. Bob goes into 2007 when the West Memphis 3 defense team obtained some of the evidence for testing in their appeal. Bob states that none of their DNA, meaning the West Memphis 3's DNA, was found at the crime scene, but he also leaves out that mostly everything tested had contamination and was inconclusive. Bob assumes that the scales of justice were tipping on the side of the West Memphis 3, but stated that the appeals would take years to complete and that the state had to do something to preserve their conviction, so both the state and the defense compromised on the Alford plea. Now let's hold up. The West Memphis 3 had an evidentiary hearing in December of 2011. If the evidence that Bob claimed was the tipping point, that it was so strong, you would assume it would have granted them a new trial, and that never happened. Instead, the defense approached the state, not the other way around. Bob acts like this is a moot point, but it's not. The state was willing to see this through. They didn't go to the defense and ask them for a compromise. The amount of years served, plus the compromise to preserve the conviction while the defendants get to maintain their innocence and walk free, was a win for both sides. But it wasn't a win for the families, the victims' families. Not for Stevie Branch Sr., not for Terry Hobbs, and not for Todd and Dana Moore. They were very much against this and would have rather it just went to a new trial. So let's keep that in mind. Again, like I said before, we have no idea how Melissa Byers would have felt. She long passed before that. But my understanding is that she did go to her grave believing that the West Memphis 3 killed her son. So Ellington, he's new in this position, right? And he took the path of least resistance. I'd be very, very curious to see what Brent Davis would have done in this situation. If anyone has access to him, like approachable access, And unless it's already been stated how he would have done it or how he would have felt, I'd be very curious. But I really don't know how he would have. But I think it would have been different. But I don't know. I'm just speculating. Bob brings up the two hairs found on and near the crime scene that may have, according to Bob, connected two new suspects to the murders. That being Terry Hobbs, stepfather of Stevie Branch, and his friend David Jacoby. Why? Because the hairs couldn't exclude them. However, as mentioned before, Thomas Fedor, forensic serologist hired by the West Memphis 3 defense team, stated, the two hairs that I know about, the one that could have in fact come from Mr. Hobbs and the one that could have in fact come from David Jacoby, constitute what I call weak evidence. Because there are other people it could have come from, and there isn't any way to really prove our selection of possible sources for that hair. I don't think, my personal opinion, I don't think that the hair evidence would be enough to convict Mr. Hobbs or Mr. Jacoby or anyone that could be in that similar situation because it's simply not strong enough. Still, that didn't stop the spin and narrative steering to point away from the West Memphis 3 and to point towards Terry Hobbs and to a certain degree David Jacoby. And this also didn't stop Natalie Maines from the Chicks, or formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, to point the finger at Terry Hobbs. So Bob wants to interview Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby because of the DNA evidence discovered in 2007. Before he does that, Bob yet again talks to another one of his DNA experts, Susanna Ryan of Pure Gold Forensics, to give him the narrative that he wants. Bob claimed all he read about of the 2007 DNA testing was from the media, and he needs it explained to him. Funny how he didn't just read what Fedor said, maybe because Bob didn't like the word weak evidence. So Bob goes into how the West Memphis Three's previous investigation was aimed to exonerate the West Memphis Three. So that's how David Jacoby gets wrapped up in this story. So because one of the hairs found at the crime scene couldn't exclude Jacoby, it made him an alternate suspect for the defense. Because of this, the court of public opinion made Jacoby a child murderer. So Bob sits down and interviews Jacoby. He asks him things like his friendship with Terry and his recollections of the night Michael, Stevie, and Christopher went missing. Jacoby comes off high-strung, anxious, and emotional. Always seems like he's about to go into a breakdown, and you can always hear that he's about to cry. Bob, he's asking Jacoby for the perfect timeline, something that would seem impossible to do with memories fading or becoming selective. Even Jacoby's worried about getting details wrong. Still, Bob assumes it is likely that Jacoby couldn't have been with Terry between the hours of 6:30 p.m. and 8 p.m. Since there's been issues between what Terry remembers and what Jacoby remembers, and it seems to be used against one and not the other, let's get into that a bit. The website How Stuff Works published an article called 10 Ways Your Memory is Completely Inaccurate. It's written by Melanie McManus. I'd like to share a bit of her insight. So she writes, while many of us think our memories as movies we simply replay in our heads, they're actually nothing like that. They're fuzzy, blurry snapshots of the past that our brains constantly tinker with. Our brain might incorporate things from the present into an old memory, for example, or fill in any gaps in our recollections with snippets of other memories. And all of our memories are sifted through our own personal filters and biases, which is why several people can observe the same incident and have different takes on what occurred. To look at it another way, our recollections are stories we remember about ourselves that contain some truths, but also details based on general truths about our lives. So it isn't abnormal that Jacoby might remember details differently than how Terry remembers them. It's not suspect because Terry gets a few details wrong well after a decade. There's no smoking gun in that. There's no gotcha moment. Memories fade and are flawed. And we are all subject to it. No one is exempt. Having said all of that, Bob feels that Jacoby isn't responsible for the murders. And again, thank Damien's moon water goddess, we have the mighty sleuth to rule him out. What would we do without him? We would all be lost without his sage investigation and wisdom. Bob reached out to Terry Hobbs prior to the docuseries, and Terry agreed to sit down and talk to Bob off the record. After that conversation, Terry declined to be interviewed for the show. Bob has his version of the story and Terry has his side, and Terry has talked about this in other podcasts. Keep in mind, many have done a hatchet job on Terry. It's happened before, and so the skepticism is clearly justified. But Bob needs answers to some pretty big questions, and he feels entitled that he gets it. How dare anyone turn Bob down? Clearly, there's something to hide if someone declines talking to Big Bad Bob. So Bob wants to get to know Terry better during the time that these murders happened. And what a better way than asking someone who has a bias towards him. So Bob goes back to the well and talks to Jolynn Hicks. Jolynn explained that his nephew Stevie was usually a happy kid except for one thing: Daddy Terry. So the narrative begins. Terry was an angry stepfather who just liked to whoop Stevie over the most arbitrary things because he was jealous of him. Jolynn, she Monday morning quarterbacks by asking why didn't the police question Terry, but I'd also like to ask, if Terry was so abusive towards Stevie, why didn't Jolynn or any other family member bring up the alleged abuse to law enforcement? Why didn't they bring up the abuse towards Stevie even before that to law enforcement? Instead, about a year after the murders, Pam's father, Jackie Hicks Sr., went on the Geraldo show to talk about the crime. So Bob meets up with Jim Clemente again to go over the list of suspects to see who fits the offender description. So they rule out Todd Moore, Michael's father. He was a truck driver and was out of state at the time. They then rule out John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, despite fitting Jim's profile. Then there's Terry Hobbs, stepfather of Stevie, who Jim asked if Terry had any hunting or butchering experience. Bob said that he didn't have a hunting background, but he used to work at a slaughterhouse. Jim said it fit the profile. Jim asked if the police did a formal interview, in which Bob replied that they didn't until 2007. Bob also brings up Terry's civil suit against Natalie Maines, where Terry was brought in for a deposition that lasted a couple of days. So Bob shows Jim some of the interview from the deposition to see what Jim thinks. Natalie Maines' attorney brings up statements from Pam's mom, Marie Hicks, and Pam's sister, Jolynn. Essentially, the statements accused Terry of being an abusive stepfather towards Stevie. The attorney asked Terry if any of those statements were true, and Terry declared that they were not. Jim acts surprised, taking accusations and conjecture as some sort of eureka moment. Jim, let's be honest, custom profile, in his opinion, matches Terry. So they watch more video from the deposition, this time a statement by Pam, Terry's ex-wife, with the claim that Terry hit her with a closed fist. Terry stated that it wasn't a true statement. The attorney asked what was true about it. Terry said that he backhanded Pam after she kept, needling and provoking him for 3 days over an accusation of seeing another woman. So Jim declares another data point in the profile: alleged abuse of Stevie and an admitted backhand slap to Pam's face. Bob plays more video for Jim, this time regarding when Terry called the police to report Stevie missing. He called when he picked up Pam from work, which was Catfish Island, at around 9:11 p.m. Terry actually didn't recall if he was the one who called or if it was Pam. Police came out to Pam's place of employment and the police took down their report. So Jim said that Terry said something that really struck a chord with him. The police were called at Catfish Island, so Jim makes the assumption that Terry didn't want the police to go to the house. And so by his logic, it would have been better to drive 5 minutes back to the house to see if Stevie was there. Again, that just sounds like we're looking at things from hindsight. It could also be determined that, hey, Pam wanted Terry or whoever to call right away, and so they called and they used the payphone. I mean, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. But anyways, Bob acts like this is some sort of epiphany. More assumptions are made by Bob that Terry could have went home to clean up and wouldn't want the police there, which makes no sense. So he doesn't want the cops to suspect anything, but his wife wouldn't. You don't think his wife wouldn't ask about anything being muddy or why was the washer or dryer on? I don't know. That's just something I'm thinking of. Now Bob is boiling with anger. The incredible Bob is angry, and you wouldn't like him if he was angry.
I'm mad!
Then his voice starts to break as he's so emotional because his desire for truth and justice is unrivaled by any other investigator who ever worked the case. Bob declares that this is something new that he never caught on to before, and thank Damien's Moonwater Goddess that it was caught on film. What an incredible coincidence. Bob is so mad that he doesn't want to see the video with Terry on it because, oh, that righteous anger is pulsing through his veins. What would Bob do if Terry was there? Perhaps serve him up some good old-fashioned truth and justice fisticuffs? I mean, give me a break with this macho bullshit. To me personally, this whole scene, it just seems scripted to me. And poorly at that. But if you ever watched it, I mean, you can draw your own conclusions. Again, maybe the perspective would be different. The scene ends with Jim stating Terry fits the profile cleanly, but it doesn't mean that he did the crime, so they need to find a way to rule him out. Never mind that the police never considered him a suspect, but regardless, and basically that means that he was cleared just on that alone. But Bob, he agrees but says it can only be done with science and DNA testing, which brings us back to Scott Ellington. So Bob tried calling Terry again with no response. There was some awkward back and forth conversations from the producers out of view. One of them asked Bob if he thinks Terry did it. Bob said it would be overstating as an investigator to determine whether he believed Terry did it or not, but he does think he's a good suspect, and the only way to know for sure is to test the evidence. Bob reaches out to Damien to let him know where he's at in the investigation, and the crux of the conversation was not being able to get a hold of Scott Ellington and how the state of Arkansas doesn't want to find out the truth. Bob declares he will never stop and he will never go away until he finds that truth. Bob calls Pam Hicks to explain the situation, and she believes it's just a big old conspiracy within the state of Arkansas. In conclusion, Bob was never able to reach Scott Ellington or obtain the evidence to test. He tells the audience that they should be furious that Ellington is hiding from the truth and that they should send letters and call his office demanding the truth. He dares Ellington to look in Pam's eyes and tell her that she doesn't deserve to know who killed her son. Bob then gets out of his chair, and he does it in this awkward walk around and leaves the view of camera. I suppose this was supposed to be a heroic walk-off moment, but it just looked silly. This sham of a docuseries finally ends with an embarrassing whimper. Hey, you! Yeah, you with the silly-looking face. The only thing sadder than Bob Ruff thinking he's a comedian is if you do not like this video and subscribe to the channel. So what are you waiting for? Do it! Just do it! Test the like button! Test the subscribe button! What are you, afraid?